so much for joining us for tonight's program, The Overseas Trade of British America, presented by historian Thomas Truxes. This evening, Dr. Truxes will share a compelling story in which the thriving port of Newport, Rhode Island played a central role. We'll learn how Atlantic trade allowed the initial survival, economic expansion, and later prosperity of British America and brought vastly different geographical regions, each with a distinctive identity and economic structure, into a single fabric. Truxes will show how colonial American prosperity was only possible because of the labor of enslaved Africans, how the colonial economy became dependent on free and open markets, and how the young United States owed its survival in the struggle of the American Revolution to Atlantic trade. Thomas Truxes is a clinical professor of Irish Studies and History at New York University, and he's written extensively on colonial trade and the early modern Atlantic economy. He is the author of 6 books, including Defying Empire, Trading with the Enemy in Colonial New York. His latest book, The Overseas Trade of British America, A Narrative History, is the basis for tonight's program, and it's available at shopnewporthistory.com. And now I'd like to present Dr. Thomas Truxes.
Hello, everybody, and it's good to see you in a virtual way. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to everyone at the Newport Historical Society for this invitation to speak on my newest book, The Overseas Trade of British America. And I'm really going to be talking about the subject broadly, because this story stretches over 300 years. The story of my book stretches over 300 years and has many, many moving parts and characters. And I can touch on, in the time we have, I can touch on highlights that I think will be of interest to you. And I'm going to divide my comments really into 6 parts. Real quickly, I'll tell you what they are, and then I'll start from the beginning. So the first thing I'm going to touch on briefly is, why is this book a narrative history? And I'll say more about that. And then I'm going to talk about the degree to which, and really the striking thing about the Atlantic economy, the commercial economy of British America, was how it was built from scratch. It was really built from very little pre-existing anything in the Americas. Plenty in Europe, but not here. So this is a cake made from scratch. Then I'm going to touch on perhaps it's not the only explanation for the success and prosperity of the system, but it helps explain quite a bit. And that is that British America was essentially a common market, and it functioned as a common market until the Revolution. And then I'm going to talk to you about a characteristic feature and really something that distinguished this trading system from what was the norm in Europe, and that is the emphasis on private initiative, which was, of course, not original to British America, but it was how it worked. And then I'm going to bring in perhaps what is really the most important part of the story, and should not be forgotten, and that is the debt that the prosperity of colonial America, built through trade, owes to enslaved African captives. And we take that off the table. We just don't have the system that we did and the success that we did. So we need to make that recognition. And then I'm going to touch on finally the role that colonial trade played in bringing about the success of the American Revolution. So first of all, why is this book presented as narrative history? This is a work of economic history, and typically, and I almost want to say almost always, but that may not be fair, but typically works of economic history are presented in a very different way. This book has plenty of data, meaning an appendix and some tables that give some pretty clear numerical evidence of the growth of commerce. But this book is framed out as a story, a story that has a beginning. It goes through processes of development. There are crises that need to be overcome. There is periods of decline, periods of growth, periods during which the system comes together and functions extremely well, then hits a very rough patch following the 7 Years' War, meaning following the end of the what we call in the United States the French and Indian War in 1763, and then comes the great crisis of the American Revolution, and then the emergence based on the experience developed over the extent of the subject, based on that experience and infrastructure, America's outreach into the world aboard, and I'm really making reference to trade aboard the ship Empress of China in 1784, right on the heels of the American Revolution, of a voyage mounted by veterans of the American Revolution who were dealing with a significant crisis at that moment, meaning how are we going to move forward? And they did it in the most impressive way, the voyage of the Empress of China. So this is a story that moves, that actually has an arc. It has a beginning and a middle and a resolution. It's a story also because it has a human face, and it really is we could think of it as a founding story, as an origin story of the American economy, or more broadly of colonial America. There's other ways of looking at that story. There's other ways of thinking about that story from a religious point of view, from a purely political point of view, from many ways in which it can be framed out. But my book makes the case that this is an essential, and maybe perhaps the essential explanation for the expansion and growth of and economic success of British America. So I'm going to move on to talk about how this thing got launched. It's important to in establishing perspective on the development of colonial trade, to see it in terms of a series of steps, nearly all of which had led to a crisis that needed to be resolved, and in each case, had there been no resolution, adequate resolution, it's quite conceivable that that piece of the story would have fallen apart, and that the development would not have been able to mature. And what I mean by that is that if we look at, and unfortunately we don't have time tonight to go into a great deal about each of them, but if we look at the principal early regions, for example, the earliest region in which trade took hold was really not in what became the United States later. It was the Newfoundland fishery, and the Newfoundland fishery was critical to this story because in the 16th century, England was a backward economically a backward state, a second-rate European power, backward economically, had its trade was in the hands largely in the hands of foreigners, and it was during the middle decades of the century that, as a result of a number of political conditions in those years, I'm thinking of particularly the Dutch wars, when that forced England to find a way to take charge of its own trade. This is a story in itself, and it is covered in the first chapter of the book. But it's essentially the story of how England stepped out and grew into a maritime state. And part of that story, and then a very important part of that story, is the Newfoundland fishery that led to the expansion of English maritime capacity. And England didn't have a merchant marine of any serious account until it developed in pretty much the second half of the 16th century. And when the Dutch wars, which were a major event in the 1570s and 1580s and even thereafter, when the Dutch wars disrupted the wool trade that was being conducted with Antwerp, which was the principal trading center of Northwest Europe. When that trade became a victim of the war, and the war pretty much shut down that trade, the English needed to look beyond the previously operating system, meaning dependence on foreign merchants, trading principally in just a tiny handful of products. They needed to reach out and expand, and that period between the middle of the 16th century and the end of the century is a period of English outreach and expansion and experimentation. And part of that that relates to the fishery. Part of it also relates to English incursions into the Caribbean, challenging Spanish authority, commerce raiding at a very high pitch. And through those activities, which were a mixture of raiding and trading, England began to develop the capacity to establish a foothold in North America, which happened as all of our listeners know, happened in the first decade of the 17th century in the Chesapeake. And that foothold was very fragile, and its survival was in doubt, and that's being very generous. But its survival came about with the emergence of tobacco, which was a high value product, going through a period of high demand and market expansion in Europe, and the Chesapeake had an ideal configuration of resources and climate, soil conditions to produce high-grade tobacco, which tobacco was produced. And after a period, again, of experimentation, it was able to take off. Now, I'm citing this as an example of how a fragile settlement, barely able to sustain itself, highly dependent on resources from Europe, went through a transformation of becoming self-sustaining and developing a commerce that then led to an inflow of population, political expansion and the emergence of the Chesapeake economy with a great deal of support from the Dutch. The Dutch are part of the background story of colonial trade through pretty much through the whole story, right up through the time of the American Revolution. They're always in the background, and they're always a thorn in the side of England, in the sense that they force England to take serious political England to take serious measures to compete with a Dutch capacity, financial capacity, shipping capacity, marketing skills that were part of the story. So in each of the regions, there is a similar kind of a story. In the Caribbean, the early settlements were barely hanging on until sugar became the staple crop of the Eastern Caribbean, in the English Caribbees. In Massachusetts Bay, a similar pattern. The earliest settlers were able, in the very different picture in the and depending on which specific region we're talking about, but in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there was a significant flow of settlers into the region, but largely carried with them a good deal of property and wealth that they were able to use as a means of support for the earliest stage. But then came the need to go through a period of self-sustaining growth, and that this was the crisis there came about in the early 1640s, at the time of the beginning of the English Civil War, when a significant number of settlers from Massachusetts Bay Colony returned to England and played roles in the English Civil War, and those left behind faced a crisis, and they couldn't trade, they couldn't do business in England without encountering the risks brought on by the war, and they were significant. The war lasted from the war years, when we think of the disruptive years, were from the early 1640s through the late 1640s and even up through 1650. There was a continual disruption of commerce, which then forced the leadership in Massachusetts Bay to seek an alternative trading structure, and this was the beginning of the triangular trades, the focus on the fishery, the New England fishery, finding markets in Southern Europe, in the Atlantic Islands, the Canaries, the Azores, the Madeira Islands. This is the beginning of New England's role in the Atlantic slave trade. Goods and enslaved Africans carried into the Caribbean, exchanged for cargoes for Caribbean produce, which could then be returned home or find markets in Europe. So this out of the crisis of the English Civil War comes the restructuring of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, its economy, and the beginning the beginning of what becomes a characteristic. The characteristic of the New England economy is the dependence on these kinds of patterns of exchange, where we we carry fish to Southern Europe, where it's exchanged for local produce and bills of exchange, essentially checks. Those goods are then carried to another market, and they're exchanged, and there is profits made, and they're taken to another market and exchanged. This is the multilateral trading pattern, which becomes typical of New England and the middle colonies, which emerge later. They're not there yet, but they emerge later. Those northern colonies depend on these fragmented multilateral trading patterns, which develop a high degree of maritime skill, whereas to the south, back in the Chesapeake and in the Caribbean, and in the upper south being Virginia and Maryland, the lower south being the Carolinas and Georgia and the West Indies, and early on the eastern islands, the small islands, Barbados, Antigua, St. Christopher, Nevis, and then later after in the 1650s, when England takes over, after 1655, when England takes Jamaica from the Spanish, then after a few years it develops. Those economies producing plantation produce, sugar, and a number of smaller crops like cotton, ginger, pimento, a whole string of dye woods like brasiletto, indigo. And when those products are not typically, sometimes, but not typically, traded in those multilateral patterns. They're traded in bilateral exchanges through mostly through, once the navigation laws are established, through English ports. But there was a good deal of trade in those. Through this, think of the opening period as a period of starts and false starts and crises, and then the resolution coming with finding something that works. And this is the really the key, I think, to getting the overview of the American commercial system in these formative years, is that it's about starting something, making something from scratch, starting something, and maybe it fails, and trying something else, and maybe it fails, and trying something until something works. And they had the founding figures in these regions had that capacity, which I think is significant, in being willing to experiment. And they had the capacity. They had the capacity to try something different. Now, this was necessary to a large degree because the chartered companies that had been responsible going back into the 16th century in establishing and in making the English commercial outreach in Europe work, for example, a chartered company trading to Russia, the Muscovy Company, a chartered company trading into the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant Company, a chartered company trading into Northwest Africa, the Morocco Company. There's several other companies. These were chartered companies. They had monopoly rights. They had royal privileges. They were in the hands of elite, wealthy, powerful London merchant houses. And when that model was tried in the Atlantic, it failed in every single case. The investors expected quick returns. Well, there were no harbors, there was no commercial infrastructure, there were no roads, there were no cities, there was no internal distribution system, as there was in those European places. Trade in the Eastern Mediterranean has a history of 4,000 or 5,000 years. I mean, there's no comparison between initiating trade in a place where trade is well established and initiating trade in North America, where there was zero infrastructure. And that infrastructure had to be created. Again, experimentation, trying this, trying that, what works, which points are going to make the best trading towns and why. And in every case, without exception, there is that spirit of initiative, of enterprise and experimentation without the money, without the capital that could be accumulated through those chartered companies, which could enlist massive amounts of resources to make trade work. So this is the feature, and the expansion of trade in each of those regions. Now the regions I'm talking about initially are the Chesapeake, the Caribbean, and New England, and also Newfoundland, because Newfoundland was not a colony. The Newfoundland fishing stations were not a colony, and they, even through the American Revolution, they were not colonies. They were treated by the government as fishing stations, really extensions of the fishing towns along the southern coast of England. But even there, it's about experimentation and initiative and market outreach, because their trade was disrupted by the English Civil War. That fishery faced competition that was significant, but perhaps most important, the fishery became integrated, even though it was not a colonial, operating within a colonial structure. It became integrated into the North American economic structure and into the West Indian economic structure, and it was part of the system, and it had the earliest roots, even though Newfoundland was different in the way it was organized and financed, and its trade was financed and structured. It became integral to the system. So one of the things that I early on, many years ago, was just struck by in thinking about the subject, and this is a subject I've been thinking about for a very long time, was the really astonishing geographical diversity, climate diversity, resource diversity over this long stretch that is encompassed by colonial commerce. If we begin in the furthest northern region in Newfoundland and follow the coast down through, once Nova Scotia becomes part of the system, down through Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, down through Nova Scotia, along the New England coast, through after the English takeover of the Dutch territory on the North American mainland, we have the beginning in the late 17th century of the formation of provincial New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Once we follow that coast down, and just all along into the Chesapeake, down through Maryland, through Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, into the Caribbean, we see an astonishing range of resources and conditions that allow the production of very different kinds of products, all of which have markets. Some of those markets are in England and Britain later, Britain after 1707. They're in England. Some of those markets are on the European continent. Some of those markets are in other places within the region. A vibrant service economy develops. If we can just imagine ourselves in just pick a year, we'll kind of come up into the 18th century, maybe 1750, a year in which war was not being conducted. And we were to visit any of the ports, visit Newport, Rhode Island, visit smaller ports like New London, or and bigger places like New York and Boston, going down the coast, all these various places. We would see an enormous amount of traffic moving back and forth along that coast and into the Caribbean, and then as essentially an internal service structure, a service economy. And then we would see a good deal of movement of produce, especially from the plantation colonies, from the Chesapeake and from the Caribbean. We would see large shipments of American produce into the British Isles. Most of the sugar being consumed within the British Isles, and most of the tobacco being re-exported to mainland Europe from England. But we would see that plantation produce being centered on England and on Great Britain later. And we would see most of the activity, most of the export, eastward bound export from New England and the middle colonies, either heading to other places in Europe, some of it legal, some of it not, or heading into the Caribbean. But we would see just a fraction of it. I mean, it would be a significant fraction, but we would see a much greater degree of diversity in the range of exports, the range of markets, the range of products that would be coming out of the northern colonies, and the northern colonies became enriched themselves by serving those plantation colonies, especially in the Caribbean. We would find it. We would just find it the most typical kind of activity would be the cargo leaving a place like Boston and New York, heading into the Atlantic Islands, or heading into the Caribbean, and converting its lumber, building products, foodstuffs into produce, which would then be through another set of exchanges sent into the British Isles or sent back into the north in this fragmented, really high energy fragmented structure with lots of local initiative in the north, meaning a great deal as we move forward in time. There is going to be a greater and greater share of the capital resources that fund trade in the north coming from local sources. And most of the trade that was being conducted in the plantation colonies is going to come from financial sources abroad, well, mostly Britain. And if we look at this, if we look at the picture, if we were to step back and see it this way, we would see a vigorous spirit of enterprise. It's a phrase that's been used to describe commerce in the middle colonies, particularly Philadelphia, New York. We see a vigorous spirit of enterprise that has its center and its roots in those northern colonies, and a high degree of local wealth accumulation as a result. That doesn't mean that North American merchants were ever, in the northern colonies, ever as conspicuously wealthy as their English counterparts or as the wealthiest plantation, the wealthiest planters. But we're seeing, but they become the resources and wealth that is being built in the North becomes develops to a state where it has the capacity to create vibrant commercial economies up and down the coast. It's a feature of the time. And in fact, if we were to look at Newport from this perspective, we would see Newport is really almost a case study in how a commercial center can grow prosperous through local initiative and experimentation and commerce. My book includes reference to a Newport ship. It was called the Charlotte. It was owned by Aaron Lopez, a major commercial figure. This is a voyage of slightly over a year and a few days. From July 1766 to July 1767. The ship traveled 12,000 miles to conduct this trading voyage. It left Newport with a mixed cargo for Bristol in England. It picked up a cargo, and I wish I had more time to go into all the details of the cargoes, but it carried a cargo destined for Ireland, for Cork, the town of Cork in the south of Ireland. It hit a very bad weather, had to make a call at Milford Haven, which is in Wales, where it's actually a naval station and an important local maritime place, where it underwent some repairs. Went to Cork. It loaded Irish provisions. Ireland was the principal Atlantic exporter of salted beef, and butter, and pork in the 18th century, and one of its largest markets was in the Caribbean. It carried its provisions from Cork to into the Eastern Caribbean, calling it at Dominica, then Grenada, then St. Vincent. And at St. Vincent, it makes it such a good story. The captain left the ship unannounced. He left the ship. He had taken an Irish woman aboard, and he left the ship, and to the enormous consternation of the mate and Aaron Lopez, the ship but finally they got themselves sorted out, took on a new captain. The ship then headed to Savannah Lamar on the northern coast of Jamaica, from where it made a connection with one of Aaron Lopez's relations, and then it took on a cargo for the Bay of Honduras, returning with logwood, which was a dyewood, a very important, valuable dyewood. Returned to Savannah Lamar, and then headed back to Newport. So in a year now that is, when I say typical, it's hard to say what is typical and what is not typical, because every one of these voyages has its own distinctive character to it. And if you happen to be in Historical Society and you have a chance to look through documents, which I hope you will someday, you will be dazzled by the variety of configurations in trading voyages. And that would have been true at Newport. It was absolutely the case, and it would have been true at other places too, along that coast, because that's how they operated. These exchanges were done. The exchanges were done in bits and pieces. And sometimes a ship was outfitted by a wealthy or reasonably wealthy trader, or a partnership, or it was a small vessel with a merchant ship captain operating on fairly limited resources and kind of scratching things along and making it happen. But it was a large number of entrepreneurs, and no influence of chartered companies. Verboten, no chartered companies, no monopoly interference. We step back now, we'll see some of these things coming together. We have multiple ways of trading, but they fit into two large categories, broad categories. One of those categories is kind of the northern model of fragmented, multi-legged voyages that are often opportunistic. Like, we don't know what cargo we're going to load when we get to St. Vincent, for example. We have to get there and find out what's available. So we have a great deal of responsibility given to ship captains, and sometimes supercargos. The supercargo being the name of the individual who serves as the agent of the merchant back home. But many, in fact, typically New England voyages used the captain served as a supercargo, carried on the business of the ship from one port to another. So opportunistic. We don't know. We don't know when we get to the Canaries whether we're going to be taking on wine, or whether we're going to be taking on something else, or whether we're going to find very little to take on and then move somewhere else. This is the pattern of the North is as I said, opportunistic, entrepreneurial, and it depends on resourcefulness and initiative and efficiency. And northern merchants were very thrifty for this reason, because when that ship leaves for one of these voyages, the folks back home will not know. It typically will not know how the entire voyage transpired, because it's going to be responsive to whatever local conditions are, what local markets are, what local opportunities are. So that's the region to the north, even though there's lots of variety that I'm not really touching on within that region, and there are certain established trades within that region, such as and annual trades, such as the Flax trade to Ireland, and come from New York and Philadelphia. And I'll touch on that very briefly, because I have to be careful of my time. But there, in that case, we have now, I've mentioned Ireland being the largest exporter of salted beef, butter, and pork in the Atlantic, and Ireland was also a major producer of linen cloth. And in fact, the generic name for Irish linen in shops in New England and in the Middle Colonies, and I presume elsewhere, was Irish. When one bought a yard of linen, one said, "I need a yard of Irish," typically. So in any case, Ireland was a major exporter of linen, exporting 25 million yards of linen at the time of the American Revolution. That's a lot of linen. So Ireland had and certain Irish regions were major producers of flax, but the flax was grown from imported seeds, and that was because fine linen and even medium grade linen needed to be produced from flax plants that had not gone to seed. So if you're going to use your resource to produce the fibers, you're not going to get the seeds. And so New England and the middle colonies became the source of flaxseed for Ireland. New York, the total annual export when we get into the from the mid 50s up through the American Revolution, anywhere between 50 and 65 full shiploads of flaxseed a year coming out of those ports going to Ireland. Enormous amounts of flaxseed that were then sold and planted, plants grown into flax, which was then produced into linen. Had a European market, it actually had mostly a British Isles market and an American market. And there you have that's a different model from what I talked about earlier, because the typical New England trade was opportunistic. It was, we're going to kind of figure out a way to make this work. It's going to be different this time from what it was last time. Whereas the flaxseed trade there was a pattern that was followed annually. The ships left New York and Philadelphia and some other places too, in anywhere from late November to the end of January, during the worst possible sailing season in the Atlantic. They took on the cargoes of Irish provisions, typically went into the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, they took on cargoes of Caribbean produce, either took them back to British America to reload flaxseed later, or they took them back to a British port where they could be landed and not in violation of the navigation laws. So it was a triangular trade that was conducted annually. So there was a northern trade, but it wasn't the same as that multi-leg trade that I spoke of before. So we see those kinds of, there's variations, and there's more variations in New England and in the middle colonies, but there we're seeing trade that does have a that is not bilateral. Leave it at that. The plantation colony is typically bilateral, as I said before. So the south and the lower south of North America and the Caribbean are taken together represent kind of a second area. But in each of those, the areas of the north, it has different regions in it that can produce different products. So you have a variety of stuff that can be traded. And in the southern region, in the region to the south, I better put it that way, in the region to the south, there's also a considerable variation in climate and geography. So we have the enormous rice trade that grows up in the Carolinas. We have the tobacco and grain trade that grows up in the Chesapeake. And we have the sugar and other West Indian produce trades that grow up in the Caribbean in that zone. And we have those different trades because we have soil conditions, we have rainfall patterns that are different, we have just a geographic variety, climate conditions of all kinds. And so all of this variety of climate and geography within those two zones, the whole thing starting from the fisheries of Newfoundland all the way down into Barbados, all of that is a free market. All of that is a zone that ships can move freely about without paying internal tariffs, without paying special fees. Occasionally, colonial legislators tried to slap on fees, and they were the Board of Trade in London and the ministry put a stop to it immediately when that began to happen, because they recognized the significance of this open free market. So trade was encouraged and encouraged by this. What about smuggling? I thought, I had the sense that Americans were great smugglers. How does smuggling fit into this? Well, it does. It does fit into this. So I have described for you something about the geography and something about the structures. But each of the European maritime states, now that's England, it's Britain, Great Britain. So let's go beyond 1707. So Great Britain, France, Spain, Spain and Portugal, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, the Danes, Denmark. Each of them had a trading structure that was distinctive. And in the case of France and Great Britain and Spain, it was highly restrictive. Now, we're restrictive in different ways, but those were very restrictive. The Dutch and the Danes were the Dutch system and the Danish system were much more open than, particularly the Dutch, than the British, the French, and the Spanish. A point to touch on, just to mention, is that it's one thing to create a rigid structure of trade. It's another thing to be able to enforce it, and another thing to be able to really want to enforce it. We have, I mean, to be willing to enforce it in a way that's going to lead to serious disruptions of trade. So the capacity to enforce was really very limited. So there were, in addition to the English holdings in the Caribbean, of course, there were French holdings in the Caribbean, and there were a few Dutch holdings and a small number of Danish holdings. And then there were some, of course, Spanish places, large islands, particularly Cuba and Puerto Rico, and settlements along the part of Hispaniola that was controlled by the Spanish, Santo Domingo, and then the ports along the Spanish Main. Now, I'll just make a quick comment about each of them. The French had a model that was created in the 17th century. Some of you will be familiar with the great finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who developed this. It was called the exclusive, meaning our trade is exclusive to us only. We will tolerate no foreign ships in our ports, and we're not going to do business with any. We're not going to do business with any except French, the French Atlantic ports. So the French islands were restricted to do business exclusively with their countrymen. Okay, the English navigation laws were exclusive up to a point, but there were numerous loopholes in the English system that allowed some trade to Spanish territories and some trade to French territories. It was not as rigidly exclusive. The Spanish was by far the most restrictive. There was simply a giant keep out sign in the Spanish Caribbean and in the Spanish mainland, in North and South America. So does this mean that there was no trade? No, it doesn't, because each of those places, the French colonies and the Spanish colonies, particularly those from an English perspective, from a British perspective, each of those needed to be serviced. The French plantation colonies needed to feed their slaves. They needed building supplies. They needed fabrics. They needed the stuff, whatever the stuff was. They needed. They needed whatever the British plantation colonies required to function properly. The French required to function properly, and so it was over time became increasingly convenient for Spanish authorities to French authorities to look the other way, even though there were occasional crackdowns that were very severe. So that this incubated a thriving commerce into the French islands from British North America. Essentially, the French islands became dependent on British North America, and the Spanish were the most strict of all, But once the English had taken Jamaica in the middle part of the 17th century, and once Jamaica developed into actually a viable commercial place, it became a jumping off point of enormous significance into the Spanish Main. And this meant that the Spanish settlers in those regions who were inadequately supplied from home had a source for what they wanted. We're talking about, in all these places, metal goods, fabrics, window glass. You think of it. You think of make a list of manufactured goods that you would need in a community to function reasonably well. And if it's not coming from Spain, it's going to come from someplace. And the someplace was either Britain itself, channeled through Jamaica, or British North America, channeled through Jamaica. The Dutch serviced the French, the Dutch serviced the Spanish through through Curacao, their little island of Curacao off the coast of Venezuela. It's one of the ABC islands. Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. And
okay, well, our first question comes from Peter, and he says, it seems the gravest early problem was absence of sufficient labor, leading to the majority of arrivals in America coming in bondage for the first 100 years, not as slaves, but as indentures. Was trade also impacted by their lack of labor?
When we think of British America, we're looking at a place that was resource rich and labor poor. When we look back at Europe, we see a place that is labor rich, meaning oversupplied, and resource poor. So they're just the opposite. And so when we talk about settlers or immigrants coming in bondage, we should be careful about that because they were, except for convicts who were sent to America essentially as an alternative to being executed in England. The choice was, do you want to be transported to America? They didn't really ask the question. It was a judgment of the court. Do you want to be executed in America, or do you want to be sent? Do you want to be executed in Britain, or do you want to be sent to America? Now, with a case of convicts, that's a special case because their terms of confinement were typically twice the length. I don't know if we can get an average exactly, but something in the range of about 15 years. But for the indentured servants, really the bulk of the population that came under indentured servitude, for the bulk of them, it was a free choice. The individual, and regulated by Parliament and regulated by statute and governed by courts. The individual made a statement or made an appearance before a magistrate, and an indentured agreement was made. Typically, over the stretch of the years in which indentured servitude played a role, and that's right up to the Revolution, indentures were, and the term of service was usually 3 to 4 years. And now in the very beginning of, if we go back into the middle decades of the 17th century, indentures were probably longer, but we don't have the kind of records that would let us say specifically how long, but they were, but this was, instead of this being a punishment or this being like a curse, this was nothing but an opportunity. Because that individual, in remaining in the case of the British, remaining at home, was pretty much destined to poverty, a life of poverty in Britain. London was really a kind of a warehouse of impoverished people. The conditions were just really rough on the poor. Agricultural labor was The share of the population that was required on the land was diminishing constantly for a number of reasons that had to do with enclosures, which is a very interesting subject in itself. But in other words, and then signing on as an indentured laborer in America was going to essentially confine one to typically 3 or 4 years of labor. It could have been agricultural labor. It could have been in a workshop. It could have been in a warehouse. It could have been any number of things. But that individual at the end of that period of time was free and free to establish him or herself in a new and fast growing economy. And the standard of living for ordinary people in British America was higher than the standard of living for ordinary people in Britain. And it was really striking the degree to which this was true. This doesn't mean that the ordinary people were wealthy. When I say they were better off, I mean marginally better off than had they been, typically than they would have been at home. So did this impact trade? Absolutely did. And I'll touch on that. And then if there's another question, I'd like to respond to that too. Because particularly this was true with the ships that carried the heavy cargoes, the bulk cargoes, like flaxseed, like sugar, or like tobacco. Those ships carried heavy loads eastward, full shiploads eastward. The Western traffic was typically in manufactured goods, which took up considerably less volume aboard a ship. So if we're to look at bulk, the heaviest bulk is going east. Much lighter bulk is coming west because manufactured goods take up less space. Boils down to that. And those ships had extra carrying capacity. This meant that the group could be 10, or the group could be 100, or it could be more, but usually they were not as large as 100. But there was a steady traffic of indentured servants back westward across the Atlantic because the ships had the carrying capacity to bring them. And this meant that there was really an affordable way to cross the Atlantic. There's no way in the world that the impoverished populations of England, Scotland, and Ireland could have ever afforded to cross the Atlantic except through this system. And this isn't to say for a second that there weren't abuses or there weren't problems, because there were, but it was on balance, in my view, it was an opportunity. It was in fact, I think it was one of the really most admirable features of the colonial economy is that colonial trading system was that it provided a means of bringing a population over, and that population grew and became significant by the time of the American Revolution. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, you have one other question. It is from Maggie, and she asks, can you comment on the success of the trading and entrepreneurial spirit of the first settlers in Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Boston Neck, and Newport as a function of the dispossession of land from the native population?
Yes. This is a complex story, to say the least, because this would be a different picture in different places. I mean, there isn't any one, universal answer to that question. But if we're looking at this strictly from the point of view of trade, which can be looked at from many points of view, but if we look at it strictly from the point of view of trade, we're going to see an early degree of cooperation in that the very earliest settlers in Massachusetts Bay, in Plymouth, in both Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies, had some success in the fur trade, and they never quite could match the Dutch success, but they had some success. And that required cooperation with the native people. As we move forward and as population grows, now we're looking at the expropriation through various means. And I mean, this goes way beyond our subject today, but clearly the expropriation of territory from native people used to plant towns, to establish towns, to grow crops, to raise animals. In other words, the stuff that was produced in the New England colonies, in the agricultural base from the agricultural base of the New England colonies, obviously came from the land that was there, and that land had been in the possession of the native people. And so is there a relationship between the expansion of trade and the reduction of opportunities for native people, meaning the reduction of their agricultural resources for them, the reduction of the hunting territories for them? Yes, absolutely. So there is that connection. So there is the native people absolutely were exploited and as part of the process of the expansion of the economy. So the economy, and this is an opportunity just to touch on enslaved African labor. The colonial economy was thriving, but it owes a great debt to those peoples, the native people and the enslaved Africans, who were in the one case faced a reduction of the resources available to them and were pushed further away on the one hand, and in the case of enslaved Africans who produced the greatest wealth of all. The plantation economies, meaning the tobacco economy, the rice economy, and the sugar economy, those three products, they were the great wealth builders of colonial America, and they were entirely dependent on enslaved labor. And the northern colonies, wealth there came about in servicing those economies, but there was also a large number of enslaved Africans in the northern colonies too. And if we could make that trip back in time and to any of the New England ports, we'd see plenty of enslaved men aboard the coasting vessels as crews. We'd see them working in the warehouses. We would see them everywhere. They would be part of that commercial economy in the North. So it's not just the southern colonies by any means, but did the native people and did the African captives brought here, did they pay a high price? Absolutely, they did. Absolutely, that is part of the story, and it needs to be remembered when we look at this astonishing wealth building that went on to create this vibrant society in such a short period of time. That's a short period of time, running from the early decades of the 17th century to the outbreak of the American Revolution. That's a very short period of time in human history to be building from scratch such a vibrant economy. But it's not like it didn't come with a price, and to not recognize that and to think that there wasn't a great deal of suffering in the process is to miss a big part of the story. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'd like to thank you and the folks at Newport Historical Society, and I encourage all of our participants today, if you have a chance to visit there, do. And I would tell you, as some of my greatest experiences as doing research as a researcher have been in that manuscript room, and it has a very special place for me. And so good night, everybody, and thanks so much.